What does it mean to be Canadian?
So, to be Canadian is to be kind, respectful, empathetic. Really, there's no defined what a Canadian is, but if you look at the typical Canadian stereotype, we're very kind, we apologetic, we love poutine.
Timbits.
Shut the hell up.
To be polite, to be kind, to say sorry.
Being a Canadian means that you're accepting of other cultures.
It means to be a mosaic of all cultures.
Being a Canadian means being nice and welcome.
Diversity, culture, and strength.
Diverse.
Multiculturalism.
I think being Canadian is like having multiculturalism and being accepting of other people.
To love Tim Hortons.
Tim Hortons.
Timbits.
Poutine. To love beaver tails.
Stick and puck.
Hockey.
The Oilers.
Beer.
Moose.
Canadians are very apologetic.
Sorry, eh?
Being apologetic. Sorry.
Being Canadian is like going to a potluck. You choose what you like, leave what you don't like.
Living in the prairies and seeing the stars.
Living
Living
in
in
cold
cold
winters.
The harsh winter.
To me, being Canadian means being awesome and cool. Just like me. I'm the prototype of a real Canadian.
So, what does it mean to be Canadian? Does it mean you have to be born and raised in Canada? Or perhaps to belong to a country united by diversity? Maybe it's to love nature and the outdoors, or to be polite and humble yet resilient and persevering? To be tolerant and inclusive? To be able to withstand freezing temperatures? Speak both French and English? To partake in hockey or lacrosse? Have free healthcare? To love the tragically hip and Tim Hortons? There just seems to be an endless number of responses for this conundrum that one might come to think, does being Canadian even have a set identity or culture? You know, maybe being Canadian means to be confused about how to define us. I like to think of Canadian identity as how my Canadian Studies 30 teacher puts it.
To be Canadian is to find a sense of self in the midst of really unparalleled diversity, I think.
And yeah, I'd like to say it's pretty true. Because Canada offers many opportunities for great education, living conditions, and multicultural society, it draws people from around the world to immigrate to Canada. The more cultures from around the world intertwine, the more we integrate all sorts of pre-existing and new backgrounds within our community to form one big mosaic, meaning you've got a hefty number of identities to identify with. Though we spend most of our time wondering what it means to be Canadian, whether our definition stems from stereotypes and whatnot, we often undermine how these ideologies or stereotypes came to be, which is what I'm gonna try to explain in this video. Explaining some stereotypes in some ways they could have came to be, and how they became a staple of Canadian identity. Though I won't embark on explaining all these stereotypes, I picked 3 to talk about because I've only got a week and a half to do research, write the script, record, and edit this damn video. At any rate, to begin. Canadian phrases. In an everyday interaction with a Canadian, you may hear the phrases sorry and a. Where does this phrase come from and why is it a pinnacle of Canadian identity? The phrase a is a versatile little word. It can be a statement. Nice weather, eh? An exclamation. That was a great game, eh? Or even a way to ask for an agreement. That was a long way to Tim's, eh? It's a little tag question in a way. When a Canadian throws an A into the conversation, it's like they're inviting you to agree with them, to share in their excitement, or to help clarify a point. It's a little verbal nod, a wink and a tongue click that says we're in this together, eh? It's a symbol of community as it invites others to share small interactions with inclusivity and friendliness. It's kinda like a Swiss Army knife ready to provide as much linguistic aid in such a tiny pocket of a word. Where it comes from though is not of the Swiss people, but probably of Canada's European descendants like the British and French. A highly accepted theory of where this word came from derives from British language in the early 1800s, where in the Middle English times used interjections like a or a. The modern a that we know of today could have developed independently from the Middle English variants. Another influence for this phrase likely comes from the French phrase haine, often used by French speakers, usually in Quebec, at the end of sentences for clarification or confirmation. This is a high indicator that Canadian English and French have influenced each other over centuries of coexistence. Though the usage of a can be found used as early as the 1800s in Thomas Chandler's Halliburton's The Clockmaker, it wasn't a phrase commonly used. It is only well within the century that this phrase was popularized and used in our everyday language due to 2 comedians from the 90s, Bob and Doug McKenzie. These 2 fictional dimwit beer-drinking brothers hosted a show called The Great White North, where they played upon Canadian stereotypes, one of which was frequently employing the interjection a within their conversations. In fact, they used it so frequently that it became one of the most memorable parts of the show. It emphasized a way of speaking that already existed in Canadian English but wasn't widely recognized internationally. The show's usage of this phrase influenced Canadian pop culture so much that it made A iconic by turning it into a recurring joke and stereotype, which embedded its association with Canadian identity in and out of Canadian culture. Pretty interesting, eh? Sorry, just had to do that. And speaking of sorry, why do Canadians say sorry so much? Why are we often stereotyped as overly friendly and polite? Canadian politeness/tolerance. One of the reasons of Canada's stereotypes of being polite can be dated back in its colonial history, long before Canada was Canada. Colonial power of the British and French had strong influences within the nation, where the British were known to have manners and decorum, especially in higher classes, and the French valued community and respect. Put them together in coexistence for hundreds of years and you get a culture that contributes to values like politeness. Another reason for the stereotype is the multicultural society we live in today. I think politeness is a key role in sharing our cultural differences as we seek to form unity through respect and tolerance of backgrounds from around the world. As people from different backgrounds live and work together, Canadians often use courteous language to avoid conflict, show mutual respect, and signal inclusiveness like saying sorry even when not at fault. Which leads to phrases like sorry, and excuse me to be used prominently to display respect and friendliness towards others. Even if we tend to say these words without actually meaning them, it still signifies how it's embedded into our culture to be modest and civil. I also think because the Canadian stereotype of being polite is so renowned, I think new immigrants tend to integrate this value into their lives and inhabit polite tendencies which they contribute into our society. Another reason I think is that the stereotype of Canadians as polite, friendly, and apologetic is strongly shaped and emphasized in contrast to our big brother America and his stereotypes. While Canadians are often viewed as modest, soft-spoken, and overly courteous, Americans are frequently portrayed as loud and assertive. This cultural contrast plays a huge role in shaping both nations' identities, with Canadian politeness standing out more sharply when placed next to American boldness. American culture tends to show directness, self-promotion, and patriotism, and are often seen as unafraid to express strong opinions, dominate conversations, and assert personal freedom. These traits, while often viewed as confident and leader-like, can be viewed internationally, especially from the Canadian perspective, as brash or even arrogant. Canadians, by contrast, tend to favor diplomacy, inclusivity, and social harmony, which contributes to the image of being more reserved and thoughtful in both speech and behavior. I just think we aren't bombastic like other cultures or people may be. Though not all Canadians are polite, of course, like any other stereotype, it can be overly broad. But compared to many cultures, Canadian social behavior does tend to emphasize kindness and civility in our everyday lives. Canadian resilience. Though this Canadian stereotype isn't as renowned as many of its other counterparts, it holds significant value within Canadian identity and culture. Forms of resiliency can be found in Canada's colonial history, like the dispute between Louis Riel and the Canadian government. Many of you know this story, but if not, Louis Riel was a Métis leader who stood up for the rights of his people during a time when the Canadian government was expanding westward without considering the Indigenous or Métis land rights. During the Red River Resistance, Riel formed a temporary government to protect Métis culture and land when Canada tried to take over the Red River settlement. Despite being exiled afterward, he returned in 1885 to lead the Northwest Resistance, again fighting for Métis' right as the government ignored their petitions for land and fair treatment. Even when marked a traitor and eventually executed, Riel remained committed to his people, their identity, and their survival. His resilience lay in his courage to challenge government authority peacefully at first, and later through armed resistance, always in defense of justice for the Métis. A more recent issue that the Indigenous communities had dealt with was residential schools. First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children in Canada were forcibly taken from their families and placed in government-funded, church-run residential schools. These institutions were designed to assimilate Indigenous children into European society by erasing their languages, spiritual beliefs, and cultural identities. Children were often forbidden to speak their languages, practice their traditions, or see their families. Many suffered emotional, physical, and sexual abuse, as well as thousands never returning home, left in unmarked graves still being discovered today. Despite this trauma, Indigenous communities across Canada have shown extraordinary resilience. Survivors have shared their stories, demanded justice, and worked tirelessly to reclaim and revitalize their cultures. Efforts include the establishment of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, which gathered stories from over 6,000 survivors and issued 94 calls to action aimed at redressing this legacy of residential schools. as well as advocating for education reform so that all Canadians learn the real history of Indigenous peoples, colonization, and residential schools. Flipping onto the Canadian Forces, Canada's involvement in both World War I and II shows a powerful example of resilience, unity, and sacrifice. In World War I, they entered the war automatically under Britain, who declared war on Germany in 1914. Though they had a small population and a limited military at the time, over 600,000 Canadians enlisted, showing a willingness to serve. On the battlefield, Canadian soldiers earned a reputation for bravery, toughness, and determination, particularly during the Battle of Vimy Ridge in 1917. This was the first time all 4 Canadian divisions at the time fought together, and their success, where other allies had failed, became a defining moment of national pride. It symbolized Canada's emergence as an independent nation and demonstrated resilience under fire, in trench warfare, and in the face of loss. At home also showed resilience. With so many men enlisted, Canadian women took on new roles in factories, farms, and offices, and began pushing for greater rights, including the right to vote. The country endured shortages, rationing, and grief, but continued to support the war effort through community and sacrifice. In World War II, Canada once again stepped up with determination, entering the war independently of Britain in 1939. Over 1 million Canadians served, and the country became known for its roles in the Battle of the Atlantic, the liberations of the Netherlands, and the Normandy landings, or D-Day. Canadian forces persisted through deadly missions, including the failure of the Dieppe raid, where heavy losses only strengthened the resolve of future efforts. At the home front, Canadians again adapted the wartime life through rationing, war bonds, and industrial production, showing incredible unity and endurance. Factories shifted to produce weapons and vehicles, and women joined the military in non-combat roles for the first time. Both wars and Indigenous history showed that Canadians faced violence, death and loss, and hardship with grit and determination. The effort, both at home and on the front lines, highlights the resilience that helped shape Canada's identity as a peaceful but devoted nation willing to fight for justice and freedom. As I end this video, there are definitely, surely, far more Canadian stereotypes worthy of deeper research of how they came to be. Like, why Canadians love poutine and Tim Hortons so much. But let's be real, what isn't there to like about Tim Hortons? Or poutine? Unless you're lactose. At any rate, these are some examples of Canadian stereotypes and their historical significance, and how they might have came to be. I hope y'all learned something and maybe spark some inspo to do research on your own, because these things are actually interesting to learn about. Anywho, bye.